we're 3 out of 5 now. We're 5 by 5. We're ready to go. I think we're just about there. So I think everything's coming in. Cool. Well, good afternoon, good morning, good whatever it is for all those who are going to join into this study at some point, either live or in the second versions that appear later during the day. In just a few moments, we're going to continue our consideration and conversation about the text of 2 Corinthians and the broader Corinthian correspondence. But how are you guys doing today?
I'm doing great. Good to be here. I'm sitting in for Terry, so I got my sign ready.
Yeah. Let me make that clear. Terry's a little nervous. He wasn't going to be here. And so first he thought Doy has replaced him. But actually, Terry, it's just Walls. So you'll be all right.
It took two of us to replace him. That's the issue.
He probably would prefer you to replace him, but...
Yeah. So before we get started, we typically been doing this. It's kind of interesting. Real simple question today. I'm curious because I know that Michael's family did this. I'm pretty sure Doy's family did this. What's your favorite quick memory from a road trip your family took? All of us stuck in the back of a minivan. I can tell you I remember vividly being in the back of a Ford Pinto with bubble windows, driving, towing a trailer from Oklahoma back to California, full of furniture my parents had purchased, and joyously playing on the little tiny game thingy for, I don't know, like 5 hours in the back of that Pinto. But the joy wasn't playing the little thing. It was a 5-hour drive. And then the moment I was allowed free from the back of the car, that's my favorite memory, is that freedom that came.
Were they visiting the antique shows out there?
We've got family in Oklahoma and in Missouri, and so they were yesing to that. So they went to visit the family, but they cannot resist. They could not resist stopping at that. What about you guys? Any quick memories for us?
I remember driving 2 or 3 times from San Jose, California to Eastland, Texas, where my grandparents were. We had a green 1976 green Maverick, I remember, that we drove in. Probably my favorite part of the trip was we always tried to stop at a Mexican restaurant in Albuquerque, and I can't remember the name of it, La Hacienda, something like that, but they had the best sopapillas in the world. Nice, fluffy, puffed up sopapillas that you could pour honey inside, and we always loved stopping there, but it's been a long time.
On that note, I got to go. Sopapillas sound pretty good right about now. Yeah, I was thinking about that drive too. We moved to Texas about 20 years ago from California, so we made that drive many times. So suburban, 2 kids, 3 kids, 4 kids, all the way up to 6 kids. I don't know, 10 times probably in the last, maybe not quite that, but they're all crazy. My wife complains that I dehydrate the kids, and because I tell them we're not stopping except for gas, and the Suburban goes a long way between fuel ups, at 35 gallons. So a lot of good road trip memories, man. But I was thinking of one, as Phil was talking, way back when I was a kid, 369 Buick Skylark, pulling a trailer, visiting the kinfolk in Arkansas and Oklahoma. Who doesn't have family in Oklahoma, man? Anyway, just that, there were no video games. There was nothing. It was comic books and sleeping in the, shelf in the back window and all kinds of crazy stuff. Probably.
I remember playing with the CB radio, finding a trucker who would, indulge me for a while.
Yeah, I remember Michael was practicing. I think he was going backpacking with his dad and brother, and his backpack was about half full of comic books, if I remember right, on one of those trips.
Yeah, I might have indulged a little bit on some of those trips.
Let's go ahead and get into our study, though. So we're in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Like I mentioned before, we're going to break it into maybe 3 or 4 segments as we read through it and talk through it. As a reminder to those who are participating digitally, we're very thankful for your presence here. If you have questions or comments, let us know. We'll try our very best to bring those into the dialogue as we continue to walk through each of the components of the text. And let's get after it. Why don't we go ahead and maybe just read the first 6 verses, even though we might continue through verse 11 or so as that first text block. Michael, if you could read verses 1 through 6, that'd be a great start for us.
Sure. I'm reading out of the ESV. I wish you would bear with me in a little foolishness. Do bear with me, for I feel a divine jealousy for you, since I betrothed you to one husband to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. But I am afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. For if someone comes and proclaims another Jesus than the one we proclaimed, or if you receive a different spirit from the one you received, or if you accept a different gospel from the one you accepted, you put up with it readily enough. Indeed, I consider that I am not in the least inferior to these super apostles. Even if I am unskilled in speaking, I am not so in knowledge. Indeed, in every way we have made this plain to you in all things.
So part of the scene here is pretty similar to a trope that appears in literary genres and movie making. You see it often, like this last minute dash to the church to profess your true love for the ones that you're caring about, like Runaway Bride, The Graduate, Jane Eyre, you name the movie, it's there, where you've got that same thematic emotional push. And Paul presents himself in a slightly off-center position there. I think you probably see him as being the father of the bride in these moments. And that really drives it towards the emotional perspective that Paul has to the church of Corinth. He cares about them with that kind of depth and that kind of relationship. I think in a big sense, that's driving the rest of this chapter. N.T. Wright describes these and translates the text a little bit, talk about the other apostles as super apostles. I think there's something to be said for thinking through the relationship aspect of it, even as we kind of dig through the rest of the text itself.
Well, I think, Paul's care here, you talk about the emotion, that is carried out through every letter he wrote. His dedication to their well-being, his love for them, his care. I mean, it comes out, it just oozes out of all of his writings. I was looking at Colossians 2. I want you to know how great a struggle I have for you and those at Laodicea, for all who have not seen me face to face, that their hearts may be encouraged, being knit together in love, and so on and so on. He does that in pretty much every letter. So, not surprising that he sees himself here, at least, as the father of the bride, and he's concerned for their well-being.
It's interesting to me that he can demonstrate that kind of concern while at the same time he's essentially chastising them, using a little bit of sarcasm and irony here. And that's a gift. That not everybody can do that. Sometimes you use that kind of irony or sarcasm and you sound really, really mean. And yet Paul is able to couch it within a context of care, which is a really important lesson for us. I don't have a problem with irony and sarcasm to a degree, but it needs to be couched with care. And that's what Paul is able to do.
Yeah, from a conversational standpoint and from a teaching standpoint, sarcasm can either soar or just drop like a lead balloon. And almost always it's functioned on the quality of relationship you have with the audience. Do they understand you're being sarcastic? Do they care enough about you to give it a second look? And then even underneath this, Paul then uses a second illustration, and he talks about Adam and Eve. And so Terry's about to probably pop in and say, here's our reference, here's number 1. Michael's got his little chart, he's going to bring it up and say, garden reference. But Paul did it first, and so I'm just identifying that fact. But he lays it out there and says, look, are you guys going to be Eve? And while Eve at times bears an unfair level of burden for the rebellion, because Adam is a participant too, that's the track that the text tells us. And the way that God showed us all of these events, it does start through a dialogue with Eve as the primary speaker. And now he's saying, and it matches his illustrations. Is this where you're at? And I find that pretty important to pay attention to, especially if you start reading the religious literature that Paul could have had access to, Second Temple stuff, Apocrypha. This is a theme that's pretty regular. This kind of push and pull in the Jewish literature that's available.
Of course, the emphasis here isn't so much on Eve per se. I mean,
Right.
it's what happened to Eve's mind, which can happen to anybody's mind, and turning it into a duplicitous kind of a process where you're torn between knowing what you ought to do, the right thing to do, and then following your heart, what you want to do. And so it divides your mind, divides your heart, and that's Paul's concern here. I would just point out one of the things that we often hear from this text is, it talks about some translations will say the simplicity that is in Christ, and then we'll kind of go off on this point about how simple Christianity really is, and it's we don't want to give up that simplicity for complex things. That's not the point, of course, that he's making. The simplicity is the single-mindedness, the idea that I'm focused on what I need to be focused on. What the devil wants to do is divide your thoughts, and he can divide and conquer that way. So that's the real concern: is where's your mind going as you're thinking about Jesus? You can proclaim to be a child of God, and at the same time let your mind take you away into something else, and there you become Eve.
Yeah. And I think that draws us to the conflict that's present in the text, because there's been a constant war for the attribution, affection, connection between the brethren of Corinth and the various leadership poles inside. 1 Corinthians to 2 Corinthians, that has been partially resolved, but it's not been obviously fully resolved because this is still on the table. They're still working through it. And then there's the other unknowns that we don't know in the text, because depending on where your understanding is, the 2 Corinthians might be the fourth part of the conversation, the literary conversation. And so there's a lot of give and take that's included in this that's now coming to its full completion. We're at the end of the letter here. And so Paul's kind of driven to this destination textually. And then Paul does something that is, at least in some ways, a very common thing that I read in his letters. Using the sarcastic motif, he turns a little bit self-deprecating, where he starts talking about being the least. He sees himself in the lowest sense. And I don't think it's fully self-deprecation in the sense of a tool. I think he legitimately sees his world through that lens of being blessed with an opportunity that he himself has no real justification for having. Being least of the apostles, a true persecutor of the church, and now to be found worthy. That's a message that he uses a lot in his writing, in this chapter, in other letters, and you see it in his large conversations too.
These super apostles, I'm reading this and thinking these are orators. And you get a little sense that there's some of that going on in the beginning of 1 Corinthians, that letter that, I am of Apollos, so on, so on. And you get Paul saying, well, even if I am unskilled in speaking, and, we might find that hard to believe, but it doesn't seem to be his best quality. And he seems to admit that. And then you got these great orators. And we all know the power of great oration versus, what hopefully is versus great truth. But we know the power, unfortunately, of great oration and how it comes across, as opposed to someone who just speaks the simple truth or what have you. And Paul in chapter 10, it's kind of mentioned how Paul's not great in the physical presence, but he's mighty in the pen. And lots of preachers are probably like that. Lots of speakers are like that. So
You could connect this back to 1 Corinthians 2, and you were talking about the beginning of 1 Corinthians, but that concept of, this is not with lofty speech or wisdom, this is by the power of God, and so your faith is not resting in the wisdom of men, and that becomes a critical part of what's going on. I also get the sense that Paul is probably a bit pained to talk this way. Who really wants to brag on themselves? I mean, what kind of character wants to brag on himself all the time? And so here's Paul essentially saying, I got to be foolish here for a minute. What I'm about to do really ought to be considered folly, but it's necessary for you to get the point here, because you're following these super apostles who are taking you to another Jesus. And that's just not acceptable. And the other thing that I see here that connect back to the first letter is the idea that, when he says in verse 4, you receive a different spirit or a different gospel from the one you accepted, you put up with it readily enough. The concept of putting up with something that they ought not to be putting up with should remind us of 1 Corinthians 5, and then putting up with this guy who had his father's wife. So there's a real problem with the way they view their own tolerance here. They're putting up with things they know they ought not to be putting up with.
And I think later in this chapter, he starts saying he's foolish, they're wise, as a means to say the opposite, right? Is that irony or sarcasm? I get all those definitions mixed up, but verse 16 and following, he starts doing that, and I keep thinking these are Greeks, and I think of Athens and philosophy, and I think academics, but you guys are smart, you know what you're talking about, but I'm going to say this and do this.
I think there's in the sense of literary devices, Paul's using all of them at once. He's basically shotgunning at this section of the text. He's using some logical plays. He talks about some of the ad hominem behaviors of the super apostles. He does a little bit of himself to a certain degree when he gives them a nickname, the false apostles. And so I think there's a lot that is interwoven in the dialogue. But let's go ahead and read some more. Doyle, if you could you read all the way from chapter 7 through verse 15, or chapter 12, verse 7, 11, verse 7 through verse 15. I'll get it out eventually.
All right. Or did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that you might be exalted, because I preached God's gospel to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. So I refrained and will refrain from burdening you in any way. As the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be silenced in the regions of Achaia. And why? Because I do not love you? God knows I do. And what I'm doing, I will continue to do in order to undermine the claim of those who would like to claim that in their boasted mission they work on the same terms as we do. For such men are false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ, and no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is no surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will correspond to their deeds.
Yeah, see, so Paul fully develops that whole picture and then kind of arrives at this destination and uses terminology that's, again, tying back to Adam and Eve, tying back to Eve in that dialogue. And so he has completed that dynamic. But really, he is trying to use that as the platform to talk about the real conflict. And I think Michael hit on part of that with this contrast between their eloquence, their statements, their effectiveness, and what Paul is trying to persuade them to come back to. I think there's a good parallel to the letter to the Galatians here, and while the challenge seems different, this is not a Messianic Jew type realm. This is something else altogether, but the outcome is the same. The outcome is a potential severance from Christ because you're no longer following Christ. And I think there's a lot that we can consider there with just that. What do you guys see here? What's going on in the text that's important to you?
I guess one of the questions that comes to my mind is to what extent, I mean, obviously within what is right, but to what extent is Paul, and by extension, anyone, willing to go to save people from the fire? You talk about kind of using a shotgun approach at this point, but Paul is kind of pulling out all the stops, and the reason for it is because he sees that they're about to be led astray in such a way that's there's no turning back from. And he's making this point again in the context of demonstrating his great concern. Am I doing this because I don't love you? Well, God knows I do. That's why we're doing this. And I think that takes us back to the motivation part. It's one thing to preach and try to teach people the truth from the standpoint of just wanting to be right. But it's quite another to see, look, the motivation and purpose of this is to save people from the fire, and it needs to be done in this context of showing our love. But in that context of showing love, to be willing to do whatever we need to do to bring them out.
Yeah. Michael?
I mean, how do we answer that, right? Individually, what are we going to do? We're all preachers. We all have certain things we need to do. We all have families. We all have, other responsibilities. But that's a tough one sometimes, isn't it? When things aren't going well, or people aren't cooperating, or there's another situation you could go to. And I think Paul's in of course, unique case than we are, but you're right. I mean, what length will we go? And Paul says it in other places, I'll do whatever I have to do. That's not wrong. And I will do it. I'll give up what I have to give up.
I think about his point in Romans 9:3. I wish I myself were accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, my kinsmen, according to the flesh. He's willing to go to that extent. And I would make this point also in the context of, we're talking about irony and sarcasm and so forth, of which we do need to be really careful. I would think that the ones that would work on the most would be the ones who probably already have a sense of who you are. Somebody who just pops into a discussion and throws in a sarcastic remark, well, that's not going to get anywhere. But if they already know Paul loves them, and they do, I'm convinced they know that, then Paul's able to say the things that he says out of love, and they know it's out of love without thinking that it's going to be so hurtful and offensive that they're going to turn and walk away. So the better we know people, the better they know us, and they know our motivations, the easier it is to make these kinds of discussions happen.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things that take place in that relationship that are interesting and that are kind of unique to the group that we're talking about today. Paul identifies his willingness to labor with his hands, to labor with them. And I know both of you guys have spent large chunks of your life doing what sometimes are that bivocational thing, where you have one job to help you do a different job because that's the way it is, for all kinds of reasons. And on the other hand, most of my preaching work has been to some degree of what is sometimes talked about. He's fully supported to preach. That's what he does. And I know I've seen that been an advantage and a struggle. Like, there's good things to being fully supported to preach, and there's no doubt there's bad things. And Paul is pointing out here the way that people perceive those two relationships as being a key thing. What do you guys see from your own experiences that match what Paul is talking about? Because you're more in the Pauline box than I am for that illustration. Has that been a positive or negative for you guys? Has it been something that
Now, are you saying that because I'm bald? Is that what this is about?
Absolutely. It's because you're bald. Walls used to have better hair than me.
I still do. To me, again, from my perspective, I'm in my third location, but I've been here for, I guess, 14 years. And so to Doy's point, they know me now, right? They know me way, maybe too well in some people's eyes, and I know them, and I can get away with saying things that I probably couldn't have 10 years ago, right? When I was pretty new and of course younger. But as far as this idea of being partially supported, I mean, when I came here, they had nothing. And so I was able to do that, and I was happy to do that. And things have changed over the course of the decade and a half that I've been here, which has been great. But from a practical standpoint, there's nothing wrong with either. There's a certain independence maybe you could develop, which could be good or bad. So I think it comes down to what are you willing to do? And of course, in America today, probably that's happening more and more. People are having to do two things or two jobs. But I've done whatever I had to. I've driven trucks and waited tables, and now I teach college, which is a nice kind of easy way to do that. But I think here in Paul's case, he had to recognize that, hey, these people can't handle it. He calls it a burden, and that might be a bit sarcastic too. But man, how much does it take to recognize that in a particular congregation, and then be willing to go there and work there for however long, and then be willing to associate with them for a continued amount of time, knowing that that's a huge problem. And then the other side of that coin is, why is that such a huge problem for this particular congregation? That's always bothered me, that they had a real problem, at least with Paul. Maybe they didn't have with someone else. I don't know.
I would throw in here his point in 2 Corinthians 12:12, that signs of a true apostle were performed among you. I mean, there's kind of a fast track Paul had to getting them to see that what he was telling was right, that this is the truth. Kind of going back to that point of getting to know people, Paul spent some time there, but it wasn't like he was there a decade or anything. But at the same time, it's easy maybe for young preachers to, come into a work and just start blasting away when they see something wrong after 2 or 3 months. And their time there might not be long at that point, when the better option is to be patient. And Paul does tell Timothy to be patient in instruction, to kind of slow down, get to know them, let them get to know you, let them get to know that you care. And then you get to say things that you might not have otherwise been able to say. But Paul had a fast track to that.
Yeah, definitely so. And I think, and this is in the questions I always kind of think about is Paul referring to this as a class of people, like false apostles as a group, or has Corinth reached a point where there is a group that are physically there that are now in this position? And Paul's there, works with his hands, never takes money from them. Now he goes and preaches somewhere else. And now they've reached a point at Corinth where they are paying to some degree. Now a group of guys, in the sense of big conflicts, like who are you going to listen to? These fancy talkers that you pay a bunch of money for, or the one who actually demonstrated apostolic activity in their presence? And that heightens the conflict to me. Whether it's just one or a group, it doesn't matter. It still heightens that conflict and makes it even more important to understand how much Paul cared about even just one of the Corinthians.
Yeah, I guess I've always read this as they're there. Mm-hmm. They're actively fighting against Paul in some fashion. One of the questions I have is, as Paul writes this letter, would these false apostles have even read it? I mean, did they disdain Paul so much that they wouldn't even read something coming from him, which then would tend to undermine their position even more, because the Corinthians are reading it, but maybe they're not. I don't know. but I just wonder about that.
I think of it in
Talked
terms
about
of
this before. Sorry, Phil. We talked about this before. It blows my mind that a guy who comes in there does those apostolic works, as you mentioned, and then people are saying, yeah, but this guy over here, he talks better, he's smooth, so we're going to listen to him. And maybe to some degree they have Holy Spirit gifts and they're able to replicate some of that. I don't know either. But it, you know, as we hold Paul to such veneration, and rightly so, and then have people in the moment say, who are you? It blows my mind.
well, I guess my curmudgeon side of myself goes, I'm not surprised because human behavior is
Yeah.
much the same. We will
Jealousy
take,
has a long tradition among preachers.
yeah,
So
Yeah. And I think that goes back to that point about Adam and Eve. So I'm going to do it too. This stuff hasn't changed ever. It's always been a problem. It always will be a problem. And we always need to be fighting against it and warning against it. So, you know, why should you or I expect it to be any different?
and I love Paul's attitude here where he basically says, I'm not going to stop doing this. You know, I'm not going to give in to these guys. I'll do whatever, like we talked about, whatever is needed, and don't try to turn me away. I think there has to be that resilience to staying the course and teaching the truth, and not be swayed or not be so discouraged by those who would fight against you that you quit.
all right, let's go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, because souls are at stake. That's the issue.
Yeah. I'm going to read verses 16 through 21. That'll set us up to close out in a little bit after the reading of the last part of the text. Little dry throat here.
He's saying we're talking too much.
Yeah, no. Verse 16, chapter 11. I repeat, let no one think me foolish, but even if you do, accept me as a fool, so that I too may boast a little. What I am saying with this boastful confidence, I say not as the Lord would, but as a fool. Since many boast according to the flesh, I too will boast. For you gladly bear with fools, being wise yourselves. For you bear it if someone makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or strikes you in the face. To my shame, I must say, we were too weak for that. But whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I am speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast of that. So there's a whole lot of deep and very eviscerating sarcasm in that part of the text. Paul is very clearly mocking at this point the assumption of their wisdom in contrast to the people that they listen to. And one of the things that really strikes me is when he talks about them striking the Corinthians in the face. Like, are you cool with that? Are you okay when these super apostles who are false, essentially, Paul says they slapped you in the face? That's the kind of behavior that they had with you. Is that what you want? This is a thing where I go to the text and go, my eyes just start blinking. Like, what is actually going on with the church of Corinth that Paul, by inspiration, is providing this picture to us? This is what I go, I wonder what that was like. That's a sermon that I want to be the fly on the wall for whenever that took place, because clearly that was a sight to see. If indeed it was a sermon, who knows what it was? What do you see here?
It's clearly the irony is very striking, because that last statement he makes in verse 21, we were too weak for that. We were too weak to make slaves of you and devour you and take advantage of you and strike you in the face. We weren't strong enough, which, clearly the point, is a jab at these guys. It's like he's made himself a parody of these false apostles. They're boasting, they're strong, they're powerful, and what concern do they really have for truth?
And it's pretty obvious that he's highlighting the practicality that the concerns of the false apostles has nothing to do with the people at Corinth and their souls. And it's their concerns are elsewhere. Michael?
Well, anytime you read about false teachers, what does the word always say? Their God is their belly. They're instinctual. They're like beasts. They're here to enslave you, enrich themselves. It's always that sort of language. And Paul here said, and you let yourself do that. So he says you're strong, but of course he means you're weak. You're so weak that this happened to you. And again, as Doy pointed out, exactly the opposite of what Paul said at the end of 21. He says we're too weak for that. But what he really means is we're strong in the truth, and so that's what we're doing.
Yeah, what is true strength? What is weakness? I'm not really a fool, but if you think I am, then let me go ahead and play the fool for a minute. And it's almost comical to me, the end of verse 21, whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I speak as a fool. I dare to boast of that. Name it. Whatever someone wants to boast about, I'll boast about that. How silly is that? But that's his point. That appears to be the stance of these false apostles. They're going to boast about anything. Well, let me boast about anything. See how that works.
Michael, you want to read the last part of the text for us? Because I think that's where we need to, that's where he's leading us to. So you can go ahead and read all the way through the end of the chapter if you'd like, or stop wherever.
I know how to read, so I can go ahead and finish it out. Verse 22, sweet. Right?
Yep.
So are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I'm a better one. I'm talking like a madman. With far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers. In toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, and cold and exposure. And apart from the other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak? And I am not weak. Who is made to fall? And I am not indignant. If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus, he who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. At Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands.
Yeah, Paul is working his way into the culminating triumph of chapter 12 and say verses 8 through 10, where he's going to say, in a spiritual sense, God says to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. That's where Paul's destination will end up at. And in this layers of ironies, this kind of ties together with that sense of self-deprecation that we saw earlier that is being presented here. Are they Hebrews? Well, are they Israelites? Well, are they now servants of Christ? Well, that whole dialogue of Paul was on the way to a destination in life, and God sent him to another country. He believed, and it seems to be very indicative of his behavior, that his success was found in service to the status quo, being everything that he thought they would be, and then God shifts the table on him, and Paul willingly complies. The humbled Paul at that point.
And to start enumerating upon the things he suffered, I think is significant here, because the implication, it seems to me, is have these guys done anything like this? I mean, are they're so proud, they're boasting, and when I boast, I sound like a madman. That's what they sound like, basically. Are they willing to go through the kind of fire here that I've been through? Are they willing to take the beatings and the shipwrecks and, basically lose your life every day, to do that same thing. And that's a big test right there. I mean, you think about the book of Hebrews, the test is, am I going to stay true in the faith and be willing to suffer for it? Or does the threat of persecution and suffering make me run? And what would happen to these false apostles if they suffered to this extent? Would they be still boasting like they do? And it seems to me they wouldn't be.
Yeah, I think that's you made it the distinction. I just wanted to bring it up again. Paul's not arguing that if you didn't suffer these things or somehow not, or you're somehow lesser, right? But he's arguing, as you said, would they do it, right? Because the suffering is partially, a lot of it circumstance. And so some people I have heard read this and say, well, Paul's saying that if and I think I might have kind of thought this too, if we don't suffer, there's something wrong with us, or we're not faithful. That's not exactly the case, but it's what are we willing to do, to go back to the point from earlier. How far are we willing to go to make the right thing happen? And I think I'm with you that the answer is those guys wouldn't, and they know it.
Yeah, you don't seek out persecution. I mean, Paul did tell Timothy that those who live godly in Christ will suffer persecution. But that, again, there is a lot of circumstantial to that. Do we run from it? And in the process of running from it, essentially give up our faith, and that becomes a huge key here.
Yeah, and it's interesting that God uses Paul to teach this right here. He uses Peter to talk about persecution as a consequence of questions to your faith, because that's the Peter story. Peter is the one who's denying Jesus when in conflict on the very root nature of his faith. And Peter fails the test, the young Peter. And the mature Peter is the one who teaches from that lesson. Paul is the one who was active as the persecutor of believers. And now God has Paul teaching about the impact of persecution on the physical side of his labors. And each of those then are testimony to what we need to be grabbing onto as believers. We're willing to suffer. Okay, this is what it's going to look like. When we're challenged with our faith, this is what it's going to feel like. And look at the illustrations of those moments in both Paul and Peter, and then you end up with a better picture of what the challenge to your spiritual nature is going to look like, which then Paul defines to us to some minuscule level in Romans that I'm still working out. Like the text of Romans where he starts talking about that is a logical chaos to my tiny little brain.
Well, he's essentially saying that you know them by their fruits, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just look at the kind of life they've lived. Well, what are they willing to go through? And I just want to add this one more thing in here about this, because I've often read this and thought, what in the world does it take to have a mindset that lets you go through this? And I think he's already answered that question back in chapter 4 when he talked about the light momentary affliction. Chapter 4:17 is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. And I often thought, light affliction? Have you read what Paul's gone through? We cry if the air conditioning goes out and think the world's coming to an end. And here's Paul talking about being beaten and shipwrecked and everything else. But it's the worldview that he has that allows him to do this. I'm not looking at the things that are seen, but at the things that are not seen. And that's really the test here in the end, is where my mind, because he starts out by saying, right, I don't want your mind divided. Your mind has to be focused on what's not seen. That's where true faith comes into play.
And yet we see today, and what happens, and I know, Doy, you've written a lot about this recently, people get their feelings hurt and it blows up everything about them. It blows up their faith. It blows up their confidence because our feelings got hurt or someone disagreed with us. And that seems to be a huge issue now. Paul's not talking about getting his feelings hurt. He's talking about getting his body hurt. Can you imagine the physical toll, the 40 lashes -1, beating with all that stuff is taken? And yet it hasn't touched, as you said, his worldview, his mind. And we cry when our feelings get hurt and someone doesn't like us on Facebook.
Well, in some ways, it probably helps sharpen his focus too. If someone is going to go to the extreme of persecuting a Christian for their faith, it should make us look at that and say, that there's something about this that they don't like. That by itself doesn't make it true, but it does sharpen the focus and say, let's really keep a united mind here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think putting it into my own little lens of experiences, there's two big transformation for me as a understanding of my work kind of thing. Transformation number one was preaching overseas and seeing a different context in which my brethren worship and being part of it and what they were willing to do in order to simply be present at an assembly. That was in the Philippines. Both times I've been there. I'm always impressed by their dedication and their willingness to endure things that many Americans would just say, I'm out. I'm like, I can't make it. It's too long. It's too far. There's no way I'm going to ride on a city bus for 2.5 hours to sit and listen to a gospel meeting for 2.5 hours in, no air conditioned Philippines. And that's a big thing for me. It still is a motivator to think about my brethren in that regard and say, what am I willing to do? Second thing was just walking through the physical structures of Israel and seeing where Jesus walked and what he experienced, what the disciples likely would have seen and done. Giving a first-person perspective to these challenges help us better appreciate what we can do, not just what I'm willing to endure. But if I get the attitude that Paul had, what kind of impact can I have on my local community? What kind of impact can I have on the church at East Side or the church at West Side or at Vestavia? Like, what kind of impact can I have there if I'm willing to make my heart more like Paul's heart became? And on the end of these sections like this, that's where I'm trying to get to on the application end, is to be more like that. We've got just a few minutes left. This is the time where I go around the horn and we get last tidbits from each of you. So whoever wants to go first, go first. And if you got something important that you feel like your brethren want to hear about or need to hear about, last comments on the text, make fun of Terry, any of those things are possible.
I don't want to do that, but that last bit of this chapter where Paul goes, I'm so weak, they let me out in a basket. I mean, can you imagine, right? I've done all this stuff, but they let me out in a basket. And you know what? I'm okay with that because that's what I needed to do to further the work of the Lord. And that, you talk about making yourself look weak. A guy who got beaten up and did all this other stuff, he's let out in a basket. I mean, that to me just kind of blows my mind and shows the whole picture of Paul and how far he's willing to go to humble himself to do what needs to be done.
Yeah, I just see the focused dedication. Every time I read this, think about it, and beginning with the first part of the chapter again, I don't want you to have a divided mind. And by the time you get to the end, you have this clearer picture of a man suffering persecution. A person with a divided mind doesn't do that.
Right.
If your mind is divided, you're not going to go to that extent. You don't want to be inconvenienced. And if it's inconvenienced just a little bit, maybe, but not like this. And so that pure focus and mindset is really what this is about.
Yeah. And I'll close it out with this way. I want to thank both of you guys for being part of our conversation today. If you don't follow their published work, you should. If you want to be encouraged on a daily basis, Brother Walls has lately taken to a little bit of a comedic turn and asked some really interesting and enjoyable questions. Doy writes regularly in these really concise, bulletin-esque. But I read somewhere that bulletins don't have much value, but I ignore that and keep reading his writing. One of those recent ones I referred to internally as Doy's 10 Commandments, but externally it's his 10 thesis notification for the upcoming election. Doy doesn't have actual commandments.
Right.
There are 10 observations. It just kind of hit me that there's Doy's Decalogue right there. But I do want to thank both you guys. If you get anyone who's watching this has questions about the Bible, 2 Corinthians, spiritual focus and commitment to God, if we can help you in some way, reach out. We're happy to do so. Thanks again, guys. And thanks everybody else. Have a great